Welcome back to the Motivated Mind Zone. Glad to have you here. Today, we are diving straight into a claim that is, well, pretty extraordinary. Some might even say it sounds like a conspiracy theory.
It definitely has that feel initially, doesn't it?
It does, and it demands a really serious deep dive into the economics behind it. The big question we're unpacking today comes, surprisingly perhaps, directly from the Russian political establishment.
That's right.
Is the United States secretly actually formulating a plan to use the global crypto market, specifically thinking about dollar-pegged stablecoins here, to essentially devalue its entire staggering $37 trillion national debt?
I mean, $37 trillion, it sounds almost like science fiction or maybe, the highest level of geopolitical rumor mongering.
Uh-huh.
But, and this is the key part, when a senior advisor to President Putin makes a prepared statement at a major international forum, no less, well, you can't just dismiss it as noise, can you?
No, you really can't. You have to take it seriously.
We have to analyze the mechanism he's describing. If the idea is that the U.S. intends to execute some kind of financial reset, then the choice of stablecoins as the tool, it fundamentally changes things.
How so?
It changes how that inflation or devaluation, whatever you want to call it, gets distributed globally.
Okay, so our mission today is basically this. Trace this extraordinary claim, this idea that the U.S. wants to wipe the slate clean of $37 trillion in debt, trace it back to where it started, understand the mechanics, how does debt devaluation actually work, and then explain why stablecoins, which, seem pretty benign on the surface, might be the necessary modern tool for this alleged grand strategy.
Exactly. We're distilling arguments that, well, they really span the gamut. From Russian statecraft, like we said, all the way to some pretty radical U.S. financial proposals that have been floated, and we'll try to connect it all back to the fundamental pressures facing the dollar system today.
And it's important to stress this isn't necessarily about inventing inflation, right? The U.S. already uses inflation.
Absolutely critical point. This alleged plot isn't about inventing a new concept. It's about optimizing the delivery system for inflation, making it more efficient, perhaps more palatable, or at least less domestically painful. We'll be connecting these claims with some very specific kind of technical details about how stablecoins actually function, how they work as dollar distributors, and maybe even more importantly, how they function as geopolitical friction points for countries trying to resist, U.S. financial dominance.
All right, let's get into it. Section 1, the accusation and the grand plot. So let's start right at the source of this seismic claim. Where did it come from, and why should we really pay attention?
Okay, so the claim surfaced at the recent Eastern Economic Forum that's held in Russia. The speaker was a man named Anton Kobiakov, and his title, well, it carries significant weight. He's a senior advisor to President Vladimir Putin,
Senior advisor, good.
and not just a recent appointee. He's held this role for over a decade, which means his remarks aren't likely to be off-the-cuff comments.
Right, this isn't just some random official sounding off.
No, definitely not. It suggests sanctioned messaging, stuff that's intended for international consumption. When Kobikov speaks at a platform like the Eastern Economic Forum, he's often articulating strategic ideas or viewpoints the Russian government wants to inject into the global discourse.
Okay, so it's prepared, it's high level, it's political framing. And his core theory you mentioned was that the U.S. has this goal to fundamentally rewrite the rules. What rules and how did he suggest the U.S. plans to achieve this grand reshaping?
Kobikov argued the U.S. has these kind of dual objectives. First, to fundamentally destabilize and, quote, rewrite the rules of the gold and crypto markets, both of them. And second, tied to that, to execute this massive debt reset we talked about.
And the
The
mechanism.
key operational phrase he used was pushing the entire world into what he pretty dramatically termed the crypto cloud.
The crypto cloud. Sounds a bit vague. What does that imply?
It implies essentially a new digital financial architecture, a system where, Global transactions, maybe even savings, are primarily conducted through digital assets, moving away from the traditional banking rails we use now.
Okay, so get everyone onto these new digital rails, and then the execution of the $37 trillion debt reset happens once the world is sort of saturated in this digital system.
That's the absolute crux of the accusation, yes. He claims that once this global digital architecture is sufficiently established, the U.S. will systematically shift the value represented by its massive $37 trillion national debt, shift it into these new assets, and he specifically named stablecoins here, and then execute a deliberate, massive devaluation.
And the result.
The consequence, as he put it, would be to essentially wipe the slate clean, get rid of that crushing, frankly unmanageable debt burden, at least in real terms, not nominally, but in terms of actual purchasing power.
Wow, the scale of that kind of reset is just dizzying. $37 trillion is, I mean, it's more than the GDP of entire continents
Oh, it's
combined.
astronomical.
But this strategy, as radical as it sounds coming from Kobikov, it actually has a bit of a parallel in some recent U.S.-focused financial proposals, though the proposed tool was quite different.
Ah, you're talking about the Michael Saylor precedent.
Exactly. We need to look at that. It provides some interesting context, even if the mechanics are different.
Right. The Saylor strategy, proposed, of course, by the CEO of MicroStrategy, Michael Saylor,
Yeah.
it was kind of the aggressive, very public equivalent of Kobikov's alleged subtle plot. Saylor's advice to the Trump administration, it was famously direct, wasn't it? Dump all the U.S. gold and buy Bitcoin.
Yeah, just like that. It sounds almost like economic warfare dressed up as, simple asset management. What was the supposed benefit, the detailed thinking behind that really radical proposal?
Well, it was conceived as a strategy of immediate high-impact dominance,
Yeah.
really shaking things up. Saylor argued the U.S. could sell its entire gold reserve, which is substantial.
Yeah.
And by dumping that much gold onto the market so suddenly, the idea was it would crash the price, effectively demonetize the entire gold asset class, or at least severely damage its standing as a global monetary store of value.
Which would be a massive geopolitical move, right? Because who holds a lot of gold?
Precisely. As Saylor pointed out, central banks of strategic competitors, particularly thinking China and Russia here, they hold significant gold reserves. So crashing the gold price would instantly devastate their national balance sheets.
It's not just a financial move then. It's a strategic blow aimed squarely at rivals who are actively trying to de-dollarize, using gold as one of their main tools.
Absolutely. It takes away, or at least severely weakens, the only universally agreed upon neutral financial asset that these rivals can use to try and get around the dollar system. Then, on the other side of that trade, the U.S. would use the proceeds from selling the gold, which, at the time of the proposal, might have bought around 5 million Bitcoin, a staggering amount.
5 million Bitcoin.
Yeah, use that to build an enormous national Bitcoin reserve. Saylor calculated this could leverage the U.S. asset base to potentially $100 trillion.
There's $100 trillion.
By basically making the U.S. the world's undisputed financial anchor, controlling the world's reserve capital and its currency networks through dominance in the arguably most significant digital asset.
Okay, so we have these two scenarios emerging. Saylor's plan: sudden, aggressive, very visible, use Bitcoin to crush gold, assert dominance immediately, versus Kobikov's alleged plot: subtle, much longer term, uses distributed stablecoins for a gradual devaluation.
The methods are almost diametrically opposed in their approach, aren't they?
Yeah.
One is a sledgehammer, the other is perhaps more like water-eroding rock. But the underlying goal, arguably, is identical. Solve the $37 trillion debt problem by using digital assets in some way to fundamentally reset the national balance sheet.
And the source material suggests that the sheer scale of the debt makes some kind of drastic measure almost unavoidable.
That's the implication. That some version of this plan, whether it's the public Saylor version or the subtle Kobiakov version or maybe something else entirely, becomes potentially inevitable. The real question then is simply which path, maybe the path of least resistance, the U.S. government might eventually take, or perhaps is already subtly pursuing.
Okay, that sets the stage pretty dramatically. Let's move into the mechanics then. Section 2, devaluing debt, the oldest trick in the book. Before we dive deep into stablecoins, we probably should nail down the distinction between devaluation and default. I know our audience is knowledgeable, but quick refresher on the mechanics might be useful.
Yeah, good idea. It's a crucial difference. It's really the difference between, let's say, reputation suicide and financial stealth. Defaulting is simple.
Right,
You refuse to pay back the loan. You say, we owe you $100, but sorry, you're getting $0. That basically destroys your creditworthiness instantly.
right. Game over for borrowing in the future, essentially.
Pretty much. Devaluation, on the other hand, is much more subtle. You do pay back the nominal $100 you borrowed, but through various means, usually inflation or currency manipulation, you ensure that the $100 you pay back only buys, say, $50 worth of real goods and services compared to when you borrowed it.
It's that silent erosion of purchasing power we talked about. The U.S. meets the letter of the law, fulfills the contract by paying back the dollars owed.
But the lender, the person or country holding the debt, is the one who actually bears the real cost through that loss of purchasing power. Inflation eats away at their return.
So revisiting that simple analogy you mentioned earlier.
Right, the $100 bill analogy. Imagine the world's entire money supply is just $100, and the U.S. borrows all of it. Now, because the U.S. controls the reserve currency printing press, let's say it just prints another $100 bill out of thin air. Suddenly, there's $200 circulating.
But the amount of actual stuff to buy real estate, gold, groceries, whatever, hasn't changed, right?
Exactly. The supply of stuff stays the same, but the money supply chasing it has doubled. Basic economics says prices have to go up. That's inflation.
So that new money, that extra liquidity, it just flows into the system, bids up prices across the board.
Correct. So when the U.S. later pays back the original $100 it borrowed, it looks like they fulfilled the contract perfectly. They paid back the $100. But because of the inflation they created, that $100 is diluted. It now only buys half as much stuff as it did before. The real value of the debt they repaid has effectively been cut in half.
And the source argues this isn't some new nefarious crypto plot. It's framed as a long-standing playbook for the U.S.
Absolutely. The source correctly points out this is standard operating procedure, historically speaking. Whenever a sovereign nation, especially one that controls its own currency and happens to be the world's reserve currency issuer, gets into a serious debt predicament, like $37 trillion, devaluation through inflation is almost always the politically easiest escape route, far easier than massive tax hikes or huge spending cuts.
And we've seen this play out before in U.S. history.
Oh, definitely. It was essential for managing the massive war debt after World War II. The U.S. inflated away a significant portion of that debt over the following decades. We saw it again during the inflationary period of the 1970s, partly driven by the costs of the Vietnam War and social programs.
And most recently, perhaps most dramatically, after the huge liquidity injections during and after the 2020 pandemic.
The post-pandemic stimulus, the quantitative easing, the direct payments. It was an absolutely extraordinary exercise in rapidly expanding the money supply, creating a ton of new money, as the source puts it. The sheer volume of new dollars flooding the system meant that significant inflation was, frankly, a predictable outcome. Maybe politically inconvenient for some, but predictable from an economic standpoint.
And that inflation served its purpose in a way.
It served the same function it always does. It made the existing national debt load seem smaller relative to the now inflated nominal GDP and the larger money supply. It reduced the real burden. But here's the challenge now. When your debt is $37 trillion and growing rapidly, you need an inflation mechanism with planetary scale to achieve a meaningful reduction in that burden.
And the traditional tools, just using the domestic Fed levers, might be insufficient or cause too much domestic political pain.
That's the argument. The old tools might not be enough, or the domestic consequences might be too severe, which is exactly why this idea of a new globalized stablecoin mechanism becomes potentially very attractive from the perspective of managing that debt.
Okay, this brings us neatly to the next point then. Section 3, the economic reality check, deflation versus inflation. This also leads us directly into thinking about the sort of the natural state of the economy. There are thinkers, like Jeff Booth is one who often talks about this, who argue that technology and productivity gains mean the economy is actually inherently deflationary.
Yes, that's a really important concept to grasp here. It's the core conflict in many ways.
Hmm.
If we lived in a world where the money supply was fixed or only grew very slowly in line with real wealth creation, then technology-driven productivity gains would naturally push prices down over time.
How so?
Well, think about it. Every year, we get better at making things. We invent new technologies, we optimize supply chains, we automate labor. That means the cost of producing goods and services generally goes down.
So the same laptop or car or whatever should actually cost less money next year than it does this year in that scenario.
Exactly. That's benign, productivity-driven deflation. Things naturally get cheaper, meaning your money buys more over time.
Which sounds great for consumers, right? Your savings become more valuable automatically.
Great for consumers, yes, but absolutely disastrous for governments, and indeed anyone with large amounts of debt, especially governments trying to manage exponential debt growth, like that $37 trillion figure.
Why disastrous?
Because deflation increases the real value, the real burden of existing debt. If I owe $100 today and next year, because of deflation, that $100 buys twice as much stuff. My debt burden has effectively doubled in real terms, even though the nominal amount is the same.
Ouch. Okay, I see.
Governments absolutely cannot allow significant deflation when they're running on $37 trillion of debt. The entire system would seize up. Repayments would become impossible in real terms. Therefore, you could argue the government is structurally, almost mathematically, obligated to counteract that natural deflationary tendency with deliberate inflation.
So the inflation, we generally experience the expectation that prices will rise maybe 2-3% every year. That's entirely manufactured. It's a policy choice designed specifically to keep the debt manageable.
Largely, yes. It's become a perceived necessity of the modern fiat debt-based system. You have to inflate the currency to deflate the real value of the debt over time. So when new money floods the system, that extra liquidity we keep mentioning, created by central banks, it doesn't just sit passively in bank accounts doing nothing.
Right. People and institutions need to protect its purchasing power.
Exactly. To retain value, that new money must immediately flow into something else, into productive assets or tangible assets that are expected to hold their value against inflation.
And that's why we see things like real estate prices, stock market valuations, gold, even digital assets like Bitcoin constantly hitting new nominal all-time highs over the long term.
Precisely. It's not always because those assets are generating massive new intrinsic value year after year, although sometimes they are. Often it's simply that the measuring stick, the dollar, is getting shorter. It's losing its intrinsic value due to inflation.
So it takes more dollars to buy the same house or the same share of stock or the same ounce of gold.
Exactly right. Those assets are just performing their function as a store of value, holding their ground against the constant dilution of the currency.
So this constant managed inflation is the current method, maybe a high-friction method, for devaluing the debt.
It is. But the question Kobyakov's claim raises is, how can the U.S. government achieve a larger, perhaps faster devaluation, but crucially, with less domestic political resistance, less pain felt directly by U.S. voters?
And that's where the unique properties of stablecoins, particularly their global reach, become the key to the alleged strategy.
That's the connection. It's about leveraging globalization through new digital rails.
All right, Section 4, stablecoins and the global export of inflation. This feels like the absolute nexus of the deep dive. So, if the U.S. already has this superpower, the ability to devalue its debt domestically using the Federal Reserve and inflation, why would Kobyakov's alleged plot specifically require the use of stablecoins? What do they add?
It really comes down to two critical advantages that stablecoins offer. Advantages that the traditional dollar system, operating through banks, kind of lacks or at least doesn't have to the same degree. Those are unparalleled global distribution, and secondly, a much cleaner, perhaps less politically obvious way to externalize the resulting inflation, to export the pain, essentially.
Okay, unpack that. When the Fed inflates the dollar using traditional methods now, quantitative easing, lowering rates, Americans feel the pain pretty directly, don't they?
They do. It shows up quickly in the CPI reports.
Hmm.
It means higher grocery bills, more expensive gas, houses become less affordable, and all of that sparks immediate political backlash. Politicians get blamed, the Fed comes under pressure.
So the pain stays mostly concentrated at home, domestically, which naturally forces the Fed to sometimes slow down or even reverse course, raise rates, tighten policy. There's a feedback loop.
Exactly. But now, imagine a different system. Imagine a system where potentially billions of people around the globe are holding dollar value, not necessarily in U.S. bank accounts, which are hard for many to access, but on their smartphones, through stablecoins like USDT or USDC.
Okay.
These stablecoins, Kobiakam suggests, are the key to truly externalizing the inflation tax, spreading it thinly across a vast global user base. And this is where the technical details of how they work really matter.
Right. Let's get into the weeds a bit on the mechanics of those reserves. What exactly are these stablecoin companies holding to back the value of the tokens?
Well, the vast majority of the major regulated or at least widely used stablecoins, we're talking primarily about USDC, Tether, USDT, maybe some others, they claim to hold their reserves overwhelmingly in very safe, very liquid dollar-denominated assets. And historically, that's meant primarily short-term U.S. government debt, treasury bills specifically.
T-bills.
And increasingly, especially for some issuers, they're also using things like overnight reverse repurchase agreements or reverse repos with the Federal Reserve itself,
Yeah.
which is basically like lending money to the Fed overnight, collateralized by treasuries. Extremely safe.
So the bedrock of their stability, the thing that keeps them pegged to the dollar, is a massive holding of U.S. government debt or claims on the Fed.
That's the core idea, yes. And we are talking about huge sums of money here. The total market capitalization for major stablecoins often fluctuates, but it's consistently well over $100 billion, sometimes approaching $150 billion or even more.
And a massive percentage of that huge pool of capital directly represents holdings of U.S. government debt or similar instruments.
Absolutely. Could be 80%, 90%, even close to 100% for some of the more regulated ones, depending on their reserve composition reports. Now, this creates a really critical dynamic. Think about what happens every time someone, say, in Argentina or Nigeria or Vietnam, buys a token like USDT or USDC.
Why would they do that?
Maybe to conduct international trade more easily, maybe to hedge against the collapse of their own local currency, maybe just to save in a stable digital format outside their potentially unstable local banking system. Lots of reasons.
Okay, so they buy the stablecoin.
When they do that, the stablecoin issuer takes their dollars or converts their local currency to dollars and typically has to buy more reserves to maintain the peg. Usually that means buying more short-term U.S. treasuries.
Ah, I see. So every time someone globally adopts a dollar stablecoin.
They're indirectly creating demand for U.S. government debt. They are, in effect, helping to fund the U.S. deficit without even realizing it, perhaps. They're holding a kind of digital IOU that is ultimately backed by the U.S. state's promise to pay its debts.
Wow. So if global stablecoin adoption continues to grow, which seems to be the trend, It creates this enormous, decentralized, almost automatic mechanism for funding U.S. debt.
Exactly. And it happens without the U.S. Treasury needing to rely solely on selling bonds directly to foreign central banks or large institutional investors, which can sometimes be politically tricky or subject to changing geopolitical whims.
The funding mechanism becomes sort of self-reinforcing through global user adoption.
It does. And that's where the inflation export mechanism really kicks in, according to this theory.
Right.
Let's say the U.S. government decides it needs to effectively devalue that $37 trillion debt by, say, 10% over a few years through monetary inflation, creating more dollars. In the old system, everyone holding dollars or dollar-denominated assets suffers that 10% loss of purchasing power. But as we said, much of that pain is concentrated domestically in the U.S. or among large international holders like central banks who might then complain or diversify away. But now, with potentially billions of people globally holding dollar value via stablecoins on their phones.
That 10% loss of purchasing power is instantly and simultaneously exported to every single one of those stablecoin holders worldwide.
Precisely. The source material highlighted this by calling it a shared tax. The U.S. government gets the benefit it gets to print more money to service its enormous debt, reducing the real burden. But the resulting inflation, the cost, is diffused almost invisibly across billions of global users who probably just think they are holding a stable, safe digital dollar. They don't necessarily see it as paying an inflation tax to the U.S. government.
The scale is the real game changer here, isn't it?
Scale and distribution, yes. Stablecoins can bypass the traditional banking infrastructure entirely. They allow U.S. dollar liquidity and value to reach places and people almost instantly, just via their smartphones. No need for correspondent banks or complex international wires for basic value holding.
Which makes the dilution, the inflation, far more pervasive and immediate on a global scale than the current system allows.
Arguably, yes. In the current system, new money creation often has to flow through central banks, then commercial banks, then out into the economy. There are lags, frictions. With stablecoins, if the dollar itself is being inflated, the value held in those stablecoins arguably reflects that inflation almost immediately, everywhere at once. Kovyakov's crypto cloud is essentially the perfect infrastructure for maximizing this global, frictionless export of inflation.
And we're already seeing the groundwork being laid for this infrastructure, perhaps unintentionally through commercial means. The source mentioned the increasing integration of crypto rewards programs into everyday life.
Yes, that's a really crucial detail because it shows how the private sector is already normalizing the use and holding of digital assets, embedding them into normal financial life without any government mandate. Think about those credit cards that are popping up. They offer pretty high percentage cashback rewards, maybe 3%, 4% on categories like gas or dining. But
Yeah.
instead of getting US dollars back, you receive Bitcoin or Ethereum or maybe even a stablecoin.
Right, I've seen those. You spend normally, but you accumulate crypto automatically.
Exactly. These programs are systematically training consumers, maybe even subconsciously, to acquire and hold crypto assets just by carrying out their normal spending activities. Gas, groceries, restaurants.
So it's like an incentive system designed to gently usher mainstream users into this crypto cloud, into using digital wallets and holding digital assets without requiring them to become, crypto experts or active speculators.
Precisely. It creates the ubiquitous digital rails first, driven by commercial utility and attractive rewards. Then, maybe years down the line, if the government ever decides to make a more official, perhaps controversial, policy decision regarding digital currency or stablecoins.
The underlying infrastructure for people to use it, hold it, transact with it is already largely in place, built by Visa, MasterCard, fintech companies, crypto exchanges.
It's subtle, it's gradual, it's deniable the government can say, we're just letting innovation happen. Which, if you were designing a long-term geopolitical financial strategy, are perfect characteristics, aren't they?
They are indeed. Okay, let's pivot slightly now. Section 5. the control factor and global distrust. Because it's not just about inflation export, is it? The source makes another really provocative point that stablecoins could offer CBDC level of control without the CBDC brand. Central bank digital currency control, but without the scary government label.
That really does seem like the potential political masterstroke of this whole alleged plan, if it exists. Central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, face huge resistance globally and even domestically in the U.S. Why? Because they represent explicit direct state surveillance and control over money. Issued directly by the Federal Reserve or the Treasury, people worry about privacy, programmability, government overreach.
The big brother fear factor.
Exactly. Stablecoins, however, cleverly bypass a lot of this resistance because they are issued by private entities, companies like Circle, issuer of USDC, or Tether, issuer of USDT, or potentially others in the future. This gives them an appearance of neutrality, of being market-driven innovations, not direct government tools.
But the control is still there, just one step removed.
That's the argument. The U.S. government doesn't issue the stablecoin directly, but it gets to exert immense control through regulation. It sets the rules of the game for the private issuers, but it does so at arm's length.
So the government defines the sandbox, sets the compliance requirements, decides who gets to play. But the private companies build the technology, manage the operations, and crucially, take most of the political heat if something goes wrong or if controversial policies are implemented through the stablecoin rails.
Precisely. The government controls the regulatory on-ramp and the ongoing oversight. We see this already in the discussions around potential stablecoin legislation in the U.S., sometimes nicknamed the Genius Act in certain financial circles. This proposed kind of framework aims to explicitly limit the issuance of regulated dollar-backed stablecoins only to certain approved types of entities.
Like who?
Typically, it includes federally insured banks, maybe state-chartered trust companies, and potentially some specially approved non-bank financial firms that meet very stringent capital, liquidity, and operational standards.
Which effectively closes the door to just anyone launching a stablecoin and potentially opens the door for really massive corporate players to become dominant issuers if they meet the criteria.
It absolutely opens up that hypothetical, but maybe not so hypothetical scenario. Imagine a company like Apple or Meta, Facebook, which already control vast digital ecosystems with billions of users globally.
Yeah.
They could potentially apply for and receive a license to issue their own branded digital currency, maybe an Apple Pay coin or a Meta coin or whatever, fully regulated, fully dollar-backed.
How would they qualify? Just by being big.
They'd likely have to meet extremely stringent regulatory requirements, perhaps demonstrating deep financial commitment or loyalty to the U.S. system. The source mentioned a kind of hypothetical benchmark, like maybe needing to demonstrate $600 billion in committed U.S. spending or investment to even get considered.
Wow, $600 billion? That's a serious price of entry. It really underscores the strategic nature of this game, not just anyone gets to mint regulated digital dollars.
No, it would be a very exclusive club. But think about the result. You'd have a private sector issued, globally distributed digital currency, maybe embedded right into your phone's operating system or social media app, but it's fully dollar-backed and fully regulated by the U.S. government.
It's a distributed system technologically, maybe, but the ultimate control point remains centralized in Washington, D.C. through regulation.
That's the model, and you can see why it might appeal to the U.S. government. It avoids the political toxicity and operational burden of a direct government CBDC while still achieving global dollar distribution and maintaining regulatory oversight and control.
But this exact model, this perceived subtle control, is precisely why global distrust seems to be surging, as Kobiakov noted in his remarks. We see central banks elsewhere reacting.
Yes, exactly. We see central banks worldwide, particularly those in countries maybe less aligned with U.S. foreign policy, or those heavily reliant on commodity exports like oil, aggressively buying physical gold, record amounts in recent years.
Why gold specifically? Why not just hold dollars or maybe even these regulated stablecoins if they become widespread?
Well, there are two main reasons, boiling down to trust, or lack thereof. First is the non-auditable nature of the reserves from a foreign perspective. While major stablecoin issuers like Circle publish regular attestations from accounting firms saying, yes, the reserves are there and appropriately managed, a foreign government, say China or Russia, cannot realistically conduct its own independent, real-time, 100% foolproof audit of those reserves held within the U.S. banking system.
They're being asked to trust the US-based issuer and the US-based auditor and the US regulatory system.
Exactly. And in the world of high-stakes geopolitics, especially when trillions of dollars of national reserves are involved, trust us isn't always a compelling argument, particularly when dealing with a strategic rival.
And the second reason for distrust, you mentioned historical precedent.
Ah, yes, the ghost that haunts all international finance. 1971, the Nixon shock.
When the US unilaterally closed the gold window.
Precisely. For decades, the U.S. government had promised the world that foreign central banks could redeem their U.S. dollars for a fixed amount of physical gold held by the U.S. Treasury. That was the bedrock of the Bretton Woods system. Then, in August 1971, facing dwindling gold reserves and economic pressure, President Nixon unilaterally broke that promise. He severed the direct link between the dollar and gold overnight.
It was the ultimate financial rug pull on the entire global financial system at the time.
It absolutely was. And it established a crucial precedent that the U.S. government can, and demonstrably will, arbitrarily change the fundamental rules of the international monetary game when it perceives it to be in its own national financial interest, even if it breaks prior commitments.
So the fear among other countries is if the U.S. did that with gold convertibility back then.
What confidence can they possibly have that the U.S. won't suddenly impose new rules on stablecoin reserves sometime in the future, especially if that $37 trillion debt pressure becomes truly overwhelming?
Like what kind of rules?
Well, theoretically, the U.S. government could suddenly restrict the types of U.S. treasuries that stablecoin issuers are allowed to hold as reserves, or impose new punitive capital requirements, or change the rules around convertibility back into traditional dollars, especially for foreign holders, or even freeze assets linked to certain countries.
There's nothing technically stopping them from changing the rules again. That's like in 1971.
Nothing technical now. It's a matter of political will and perceived necessity. This inherent rule change risk makes the stablecoin essentially a trust us token from a foreign central bank's perspective.
Which forces them back to gold.
It pushes many of them back towards gold, an asset that, crucially, the U.S. government cannot unilaterally print, seize from foreign vaults, usually, or easily dilute on a global scale. It's seen as a more neutral, trust-minimized reserve asset.
So the massive gold accumulation we're witnessing by central banks isn't just about economics. It's a geopolitical statement, a quiet rebellion against this potential digital dollar future.
You could certainly interpret it that way. It's the world hedging its bets against a future where the dollar, even in digital form, remains dominant, but potentially subject to unilateral rule changes driven by U.S. domestic needs.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Let's move to the final section then. Section 6, the inevitable path. Private sector paving the way. So we established earlier that the direct sailor plan, the aggressive public dump gold buy Bitcoin move, it didn't actually happen publicly, did it? At least not under the previous administration. The government seemed wary.
That's correct. Publicly, the U.S. government, including the Treasury, stated quite clearly that it would not use taxpayer dollars to buy Bitcoin as a reserve asset. The political risk, the market volatility risk, it was just seen as too high for direct government action at that scale.
So if that direct, overt approach is too volatile, too risky, does that make Kobyakov's alleged subtle stablecoin-focused path the more likely one? Or at least a more probable direction of travel?
It seems far more probable, yes. Governments especially the U.S. government managing the world's primary reserve currency, generally abhor creating unnecessary market volatility or taking on massive visible political risk if they can avoid it. Buying a huge reserve of Bitcoin directly or deliberately crashing the global gold market overnight, those actions would almost certainly invite global panic, immediate retaliation from other central banks, and huge domestic political fights. It's just too messy.
So the backdoor strategy, as the source implies, is just smarter, more effective in the long run.
Arguably, yes. And what is that backdoor strategy? It's essentially letting the private sector do the heavy lifting first. Let corporations serve as the laboratory, the early adopters, and the deployment team for these new digital asset infrastructures.
How does that work?
Well, the government essentially allows, maybe even quietly encourages, private companies to absorb the initial volatility, the technological development costs, and the political risk associated with innovation in this space. Look again at MicroStrategy. It's a publicly traded corporation. It's not a government entity, yet it has amassed a massive, strategically significant, and growing reserve of Bitcoin on its balance sheet.
Hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin now, isn't it?
Yes, a truly enormous amount for a single company. In doing so, MicroStrategy functions almost like a quasi-public proxy. It establishes the strategic case for Bitcoin as a treasury asset. It develops the accounting and legal mechanisms for corporations to hold it, all without the U.S. government ever having to spend a single taxpayer dollar directly or risk its own AAA credit rating on a volatile asset.
So it's deniable for the government. It's subtle, it's gradual. The strategy is simply wait and see.
Pretty much. Let private innovation run its course. Let the market figure out the best technologies, the most secure custody solutions, the most useful applications. Let corporations build the global rails, like we discussed with stablecoins and rewards programs. Once corporate adoption creates a robust, secure, globally distributed digital asset infrastructure, then the government can choose how and when to step in.
How would they step in?
They could regulate it more formally, perhaps absorb parts of it, or simply leverage the existing private infrastructure for public policy goals, like managing the national debt via stablecoin inflation export.
And this pattern, letting the private sector innovate first and then the government steps in later, that mirrors historical U.S. strategy in other areas, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's a classic pattern. Think about the early internet, largely developed with government research funding, but then commercialized and scaled massively by the private sector. GPS is another example. Even things like early aviation or semiconductor manufacturing. The U.S. system often allows, even encourages, private enterprise to innovate, take risks, scale up, and prove the concept first. Then, when the innovation becomes strategically vital, maybe it's too big to fail or too important for national security or economic competitiveness, that's often when the government steps in with more formal regulation, funding, or even direct involvement.
And that stepping in doesn't necessarily mean outright nationalization, but maybe more subtle forms of absorption or control. You mentioned historical precedents.
Yes, there's ample precedent for various levels of government absorption or intervention when deemed necessary. During major crises like wars or deep recessions, the U.S. government has historically taken direct financial stakes in private companies or exercised immense regulatory control over entire industries deemed critical. The source mentioned the specific precedent of the U.S. government taking partial ownership stakes, like potentially 10% in Intel historically, but we can look much broader. Think about wartime industrial mobilization, the bank bailouts during the 2008 financial crisis, or even the creation of government-sponsored enterprises like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in the housing sector.
So the underlying lesson here, according to this line of thinking, is that the U.S. government doesn't actually need to force the market into a crypto cloud directly.
It just needs to let the corporate sector, driven by profit and innovation, build the necessary infrastructure first. The stablecoin payment rails, the large corporate Bitcoin treasuries acting as signaling mechanisms, the mass consumer adoption driven by rewards programs. Let that ecosystem mature.
And once that infrastructure is sufficiently developed and globally integrated,
The government already holds all the regulatory levers it needs through banking regulations, securities law, potential new stablecoin legislation to pivot that existing private infrastructure towards serving its ultimate public policy goal, which, in this context, Kobiakov alleges, is the managed, globally exported devaluation of the $37 trillion national debt burden.
so while Kobikov's claim of an explicit plot might sound, overly conspiratorial or aggressive,
His core underlying assumption that the sheer size of the U.S. debt will likely compel the government to employ some kind of extraordinary digital or financial measures to manage it down the road, that part seems harder to dismiss. Almost unavoidable, perhaps. The how is debatable, but the why seems pretty clear.
okay, that brings us towards the end. Let's try to synthesize this. So, wrapping up this deep dive, we've essentially explored two radically different potential paths, both originating from concerns about that enormous $37 trillion U.S. national debt. There's the overt crash and acquire strategy for dominance, using Bitcoin to supplant gold, as publicly advocated by Michael Saylor. Very aggressive, very visible.
Right. And then there's the alleged covert long-term strategy described by the Russian advisor Anton Kobyakov, involving the subtle, globally distributed devaluation of the debt using dollar-pegged stablecoins operating within a crypto cloud. Much more gradual, much less visible.
And the key takeaway seems to be
The key takeaway, I think, is that the extreme size of the U.S. national debt almost guarantees that some form of radical or unconventional action will likely be considered, or perhaps is already underway, to manage it. The status quo of just kicking the can down the road indefinitely seems increasingly unsustainable, and comparing the two paths, the subtle stablecoin mechanism appears, at least on paper, politically superior for the U.S. government's perspective. Why? Because it leverages globalization to externalize the cost of inflation onto potentially billions of global stablecoin holders, rather than concentrating the pain domestically. It also provides the U.S. with significant regulatory control over the emerging digital financial infrastructure, but at arm's length, avoiding the political toxicity of a direct CBDC. It seems like the most low-friction path, potentially, for the U.S. to service its debt without triggering immediate domestic upheaval or direct international confrontation.
okay. This entire scenario, this whole deep dive, it really leaves us with a truly provocative final thought, something for you, the listener, to maybe mull over after we finish. If these private corporate digital currencies, stablecoins issued by companies like Circle, Tether, maybe Apple, maybe Meta, which are ultimately backed by US treasuries and operate globally seamlessly via smartphones, if they do effectively become the dominant monetary infrastructure for much of the world, if they become the crypto cloud Kobyakov described, what actually happens to the very concept of national monetary sovereignty, especially for smaller countries that become heavily reliant on those digital dollar rails?
That's the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it? If the fundamental digital rails your entire economy runs on are owned and operated by large U.S. regulated private corporations, and if the underlying value, the purchasing power of the currency flowing through those rails, can be unilaterally diluted by the U.S. Treasury's need to manage its own separate national debt, how much real monetary control does a smaller nation truly retain over its own economic destiny? They become, in a sense, completely reliant on a financial system that they cannot fully audit, cannot directly control, and maybe cannot easily escape if the rules change against their favor. What does sovereignty even mean in that context?
A very sobering thought to end on, something to definitely think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into a complex and, frankly, quite startling topic. We'll see you next time on the Motivated Mind Zone.